Welcome to today's event marking the 150th anniversary of the Secret Ballot Act. I'm Philip Salmon from the History of Parliament, and we've got three other speakers lined up today. And we're also very grateful to Penny McMahon from the Parliamentary Archives for coordinating this event in Parliament and with us at the History of Parliament. I'm going to kick off with a general sort of overview of the secret ballot and Parliament. And I'll be introducing the other speakers as we go along. So exactly 150 years ago today, the Secret Ballot Act became law after a bitter political struggle in Parliament and an extraordinary showdown, what the Times called a violent collision between the Commons and the Lords, lasting almost 18 months. Now, today, of course, we take it for granted that all voting is done in private and secretly. It hardly seems a contentious topic, and it's difficult to imagine why it caused so much controversy. But at the time, the move to secret voting in the UK represented a major change, not just in the practical mode of polling, but in the whole way in which electoral politics was conceived, understood, and carried out by electors and politicians. Something that I think is particularly apparent in the very rich visual imagery of Victorian polls, like this one here showing Bedford in 1835. The conventional view, the one you'll find in most history books, is that the move to secret voting was just one of a number of electoral reforms in the UK's so-called path to democracy. So it sits alongside the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, 1884, 1918, shown here on the screen, extending the vote to ever greater numbers of people. And secret voting also helps to end some of the most glaring abuses in the old system, protecting voters from unfair pressure to vote a certain way, including, of course, pressure from landlords, customers, and employers. And it's also supposed to have made the bribing of voters far more difficult, since candidates and their agents could never be sure how a voter had actually behaved. Now, what I think this rather sort of modern view of secret voting tends to overlook, though, is the many positives and popular features associated with public voting at the time. And it's only by looking at these that the scale of the political controversy surrounding this reform becomes much more understandable. And chief among these positives was public accountability, the idea that the vote was a trust or a duty that should be exercised publicly in order to ensure that it was carried out properly. As the Prime Minister Palmerston explained in 1858, expressing the views of, I think, nearly all the party leaders at this time, an individual is invested with the power of voting not for his own personal advantage or interest, but for the interest and advantage of the nation, to be exercised in perfect daylight and be open to the criticism of our friends and neighbours and the public at large. Now, certainly most of the early Victorian MPs that we're researching at the History of Parliament had very similar views. Speaking on the hustings at the 1859 election, for instance, the Berkshire MP, Captain Leston Vernon, declared, "Damn the secret ballot. Give me the bold-faced Englishman who, with his hat on one side, swaggers up to the polling booth, and when the clerk says, 'For whom do you vote?' answers manfully and in the face of his neighbours." Now, openness was especially important at a time when only a very limited number of people could vote. Rather than being completely excluded from the electoral process, non-electors could see and judge how everyone had polled. And as a result, they often played a part in trying to influence how voters behaved. Women in particular feature frequently in surviving canvassing books and electioneering papers from the period, with comments like "wife says he will vote" or "sister promised," testifying to their role. And their role as influencers in elections also helps to explain, I think, why they are so prominent in most depictions of open-air election scenes from the mid-Victorian period, including early photographs like this one here. But women, of course, were not the only type of non-elector. Working men, including all those disfranchised by the voting restrictions of the 1832 Reform Act, something I've written quite a lot about, they also played a significant role in elections as non-electors, setting up meetings and pressure groups to persuade voters and trying to influence shopkeepers or traders in a practice known as exclusive dealing. And this was not considered as sort of inappropriate or unconstitutional as it might seem today. And many MPs actually targeted their campaigns at non-electors as well, like this poster shows. As one MP reminded a boisterous crowd of non-electors during an 1841 campaign, the vote is public property. The elector is only a trustee, and the non-electors have the right to scrutinise and to direct the exercise of the voter's function. Now, even some of the Chartists, famous, of course, for their 6 points, including manhood suffrage with the secret ballot, even they conceded that public voting gave at least some power to the unenfranchised. Fergus O'Connor, one of their leaders, actually called secret voting a mask on an honest face. And in his newspaper, the Northern Star, warned that it would stop scrutiny into the acts of your trustees, and it would destroy deference by the trustee, the voter, to popular opinion. So given all these positives, and I could list a lot more, why, it has to be asked, did the act we're marking the anniversary of today actually get passed? Well, it certainly wasn't because of a successful campaign waged by radical MPs in Parliament. Ballot motions only ever passed the Commons in very thin houses when most MPs were at dinner or asleep. And before Gladstone, shown here, took up the cause in 1868-9, the number of MPs actually supporting the ballot never topped the number achieved on the 18th of June 1839, when 216 MPs voted in its support, but 333 against. It also wasn't because of the mass mobilisation or sort of organisation of popular opinion of the kind, say, waged against the Corn Laws. I mean, the ballot became fairly popular in the 1830s, especially in large constituencies, and there was a ballot society in operation from 1853 to 65. But this was never an issue that galvanised the entire nation. Instead, the introduction of the secret voting was very much a ministerial initiative. In other words, we're talking high politics here, and it was taken up by Gladstone in order to satisfy new cabinet colleagues like John Bright and his Home Secretary, Henry Bruce. And their argument that the 1867 Reform Act had greatly diminished the number of non-electors, and therefore that whole public trust argument, by expanding the franchise, was obviously true up to a point, but all women, of course, remained without the vote until 1918. Instead, what really bolstered their case was just the sheer amount of corruption, including bribery and violence, experienced at the 1868 general election. Many of the new voters created by the Conservatives' 1867 Reform Act, it was feared, were extremely vulnerable to pressure, not just from traditional influences, but also from the newly formed trade union movement. So the battles that raged in the Commons and Lords between 1870 and 1872 over public voting were all about what sort of public duty voting actually represented and how it should best be subject to what Richard Cross called the control of public opinion. And the experience of the secret ballot in other places, in London school board elections from 1870, and of course how it worked out in Australia, where the secret ballot had been in use from 1856, ended up playing a key part in these debates and the related inquiry that was set up. And what emerged, as we'll be hearing about, was a system that was quite similar in some ways to the Australian experiment, a sort of classic example of something being tried out in the colonies before then being adopted on a trial basis in the mother country. And whether or not it actually managed to reduce violence, another major concern in the whole secret ballot debates, is also something that we'll be hearing about a little bit further on. What's clear from our own research at the history of Parliament is that public voting was actually far more participatory than is often portrayed. I mean, yes, people could be pressurised and intimidated unfairly to vote a certain way. But the upside, which of course we don't really think about, is that public voting allowed all those without a vote to see and influence how voters behaved as part of a really vibrant political culture that often engaged the entire community. And this is what the Tory leader Disraeli was talking about when he worried that secret voting would destroy public spirit in politics. In a remarkable speech, in many ways, in fact, actually echoing the views of the liberal philosopher J.S. Mill in his book Thoughts on Parliamentary Reform, Disraeli complained that secret voting would divorce public life from publicity. And without publicity, he warned, there can be no public spirit. And without public spirit, every nation must decay. That's enough from me. I now introduce the next speakers. The next speaker we'll be hearing from is Dr. Benjamin Jones. Let me just stop sharing my screen. Dr. Benjamin Jones, he comes to us live from Australia. Ben is a senior lecturer in history at Central Queensland University, and he's published widely on republicanism, on nationalism, and Australian political and social history. And we're hugely grateful to Ben for giving up his beauty sleep. I think it's currently just after about 3 o'clock in the morning in Australia, and for giving what I know will be an amazing talk on the earlier Australian experience of secret voting. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks so much. Are my slides working? Well,
yeah, they look good.
Oh, excellent. I'll take that as a yes. Well, a very early and good morning from Australia. It is 3:15 Queensland time, so if not exactly a pleasure, it is nonetheless a great honour for me to speak with you on this auspicious occasion, and a very opportune time to consider how the secret ballot came about and why it was adopted so rapidly throughout the Anglophone world from the mid to late 19th century. The first point to make is that the secret voting did not begin in Australia. In the 19th century, secret voting was actually a tautology. It was usually called simply the ballot. The secrecy was implied and was in opposition to open voting or viva voce. The etymology of the word is ballotta, Italian for the coloured balls that were used in secret votes and practices that go back to ancient Rome. And even in the 18th and 19th centuries, Massachusetts, New Brunswick and other places had already experimented with versions of secret voting. So Australia neither invented nor was the first place to implement it. Rather, a specific type of secret voting was pioneered in Australia, and the key features can be seen in this image. Firstly, the government would provide an official ballot paper, and secondly, some kind of private compartment was provided for the voter. It is this version of secret voting that was pioneered in Victoria in 1856, hence rising to international fame as the Victorian or the Australian ballot. And there are some records also in the US of it being called kangaroo voting, which I think is quite cute. Due to some fabulous scholarship by Terry Newman, we now know that Tasmania also introduced it in 1856. South Australia also legislated for it that year, but they didn't have an election till the following year. And New South Wales followed suit in 1858. Queensland had it in place from the start, separating from New South Wales in 1859. So why was the development of the Australian ballot significant? The short answer is because other attempts at secret voting were not overly secret. New York, for instance, also had secret voting in 1856, but it was a very different affair. You can see in this image there are three stands there, one for James Buchanan, who would win the election for the Democrats, John Fremont, representing the newly formed Republicans, and Millard Fillmore for the Whigs, who the Republicans had splintered off from. And there were no rules about the size or shape or colour of the ballot paper, so an eligible voter could go up to the booth of their preferred candidate and take a piece of paper, which usually would be coloured, and while they could fold it or try to hide it in their hand and walk over and place it in the ballot box to keep it secret, if they were being bribed or coerced to vote a certain way, it was pretty straightforward for them to demonstrate which way they were going to vote. And this was one of the great evils reformers in the US and UK wanted to eliminate. Especially as the male franchise extended, the practice of what was called treating was seen as a concern, which is basically when candidates would bribe enfranchised but disinterested voters with beer or liquor to vote a certain way. The Australian ballot was not innovative in the desire to be secret, but it was the most effective mechanism, at least as evidenced by how quickly it was adopted elsewhere, namely that the government would print the ballot paper to be given to voters in a private room. So that is the original feature of the Victorian legislation. But the mechanics of effective secret voting were pioneered in Australia. The case for it certainly can be traced to the English radical tradition before Australia was colonised. In 1776, the great reformer John Cartwright argued in his pamphlet Take Your Choice. Jeremy Bentham, the intellectual leader of the philosophical radicals, argued for it in the early 19th century, along with George Grote and James Mill. Though oddly enough, his famous son, John Stuart Mill, was against secret voting. The Chartists also took up the cause, and after gold was discovered in Victoria in 1851, thousands of Britons came to Australia bringing these ideas with them. So, cutting a long story very short, there was a democratic zeitgeist in the mid-19th century, and following the Eureka Rebellion in 1854, there was a palpable sense that Victoria was the place for a democratic experiment, and secret voting seemed to go hand in hand with responsible government and the rapidly expanding male franchise. And most importantly, the experiment worked. The violence and drunkenness that had marked open voting occasions was replaced with a relatively peaceful event. And arguably, this transformation had some role in New Zealand and Australia being the first places to extend voting to women. While the success of the Australian ballot is sometimes presented as a matter of national pride, it also reveals the two-way exchange of political ideas. Indeed, the three men most responsible for pioneering the Australian version of secret voting, William Nicholson, Henry Chapman, and William Boothby, were all born in England. Chapman in particular really epitomised the exchange of ideas and people around the 19th century British world. He was born in London, worked as a newspaper proprietor in Quebec, a judge in Wellington, colonial secretary in Van Diemen's Land. He turned down the governorship of the West Indies and then was elected to the Victorian Legislative Council in 1855. And he drafted the secret ballot legislation that Premier William Nicholson would introduce. So an extraordinary career and a very British one. So the men who pioneered the Australian ballot were not just influenced by, but they were part of the wider British world. Similarly, several members of Prime Minister Gladstone's Liberal government who advocated for the secret ballot had spent time in Australia. Hugh Childers, the member for Pontefract, lived in Victoria during those crucial years of 1850 to 57, while Robert Torrens, the member for Cambridge, had not only lived in South Australia, he had himself been elected by secret ballot to their legislative assembly. And of course, it wasn't just a two-way street of political ideas. There was a whole transnational network of political ideas in the Anglophone world, and that saw secret voting adopted in rapid succession in New Zealand in 1870, the UK in 72, Canada in 74, and most of the United States in the 1880s and 90s. In the UK, the Liberal MP for Bristol, Francis Berkeley, took up the cause with incredible persistence and put it forward every year from 1847 to 67. But after 1856 and the introduction of the Australian ballot, he and other reformers had an effective case study, and he had his best result in 1860 with 147 votes in support. I'm conscious of the time, so we'll just end with these observations. Although the secret ballot was undoubtedly a goal of English radicalism and a Liberal government brought it in, it seems that support from Conservatives was crucial. As the franchise widened, concerns that bosses and landlords would coerce workers and tenants to vote a certain way, Conservatives started to worry that the growing trade union movement could manipulate votes in the other direction. The successful implementation in 1872 was helped by a survey of Australian colonial governors in late 1870, who all happened to be former Conservative MPs. In Tasmania, it was Charles Duquesne, who had been the Tory MP for North Essex, and it was his judgment that the Australian ballot secures perfect order and tranquility. And James Ferguson, the South Australian governor, had also been a Tory MP, and he heartily concurred. Significantly, both had actually voted against the ballot when they were British MPs. So they had a genuine conversion, so to speak, based on their lived experience in Australia. And this, I think, had an impact on other Conservatives. So to conclude, the influence of the Victorian example and the other eastern states on Britain and then the US seems undeniable, but the instigators of the reform certainly would have considered themselves to be British. So while the contribution of the Australian colonies is important, it's part of a larger transnational story of the secret ballot, which of course is now a global phenomenon. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. That's great. Thank you. Really interesting stuff there. Our next speaker is Dr. Kathryn Rix. She co-edits the 1832 to 1945 House of Commons project, The History of Parliament. She's written extensively on electoral culture, particularly corruption, and on Parliament in the 19th century. And her book on election agents and parties covers the period 1880 through to 1910. So she's sort of perfectly placed to tell us about how some of the very first UK elections to be carried out using the secret ballot actually operated. Over to you, Kathryn.
Thanks very much, Philip. Hopefully you can see my screen and my slides okay. So as Philip's mentioned, it was exactly 150 years ago today that the Ballot Act received Royal Assent. But although we see the secret ballot as a central feature of our democratic process, when the 1872 Ballot Act was passed, it was on a trial basis. The House of Lords was very reluctant to pass this reform, and it added an amendment which stated that the Act would be in force until 1880. After that, it would have to be renewed. And the idea was that this would allow the experience of 2 general elections using the ballot. It held out hopes to opponents that this was an experiment which could be reversed. As it was, the Act was renewed on an annual basis from 1880, together with other expiring laws, and the ballot was made permanent in 1918. But it's important to remember that, at least in the minds of some people, the ballot was being tried as an experiment, and therefore the experiences of the first elections held using the new system really mattered. It was less than a month after the Ballot Act passed that the first parliamentary election using the secret ballot took place in the Yorkshire borough of Pontefract on the 15th of August 1872. This contest generated considerable interest across Britain. It was widely reported in the press, and election agents from different parts of the country flocked to Pontefract to see the new electoral machinery in action. People were keen to find out about how the ballot worked in its technical and practical aspects, and they also wanted to see what impact it had on electioneering. Did it resolve the problem of intimidation of voters? And what effects did it have on bribery? Well, before I talk in more detail about the Pontefract by-election, it's worth mentioning that the Ballot Act applied not just to parliamentary contests, but also municipal elections for town councils. And the very first election using the secret ballot took place just 5 days after the measure passed. That was a municipal by-election at Boston in Lincolnshire. Given the haste with which local officials had to make the arrangements, it's hardly surprising that there were some errors in procedure, and the local MP raised these in the Commons a few days later. It was widely reported that the ballot box had been left open rather than secured with a seal, and it was also claimed that some voters had been asked how they would vote and had their ballot papers filled in for them. By the time the Pontefract by-election was held a month later, there'd been a little more time to prepare, although, as we'll see, some of the arrangements were still rather makeshift. This by-election at Pontefract took place because one of the MPs, the Liberal Hugh Childers, who we've already heard about, had been appointed as a minister in Gladstone's government, meaning that he had to stand for re-election. Although he faced a Conservative opponent, there was little doubt of his victory, and had it not been for the novelty of seeing the ballot in operation, this by-election would probably have attracted little interest. Rather curiously, Childers, who defeated Viscount Pollington by a majority of 80 votes, had been elected once before by the secret ballot. He'd served as a member of the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, Australia, which had adopted the ballot in 1856, as we heard from Benjamin Jones. And Childers had made his maiden speech in the Westminster Parliament in 1860 on the operation of the secret ballot in Australia, which he described as thoroughly successful. The ballot adopted in the UK in 1872 operated in the same way we're familiar with today. Here's a sample ballot paper from the 1872 Act. The only major difference from today is that party labels didn't appear on ballot papers until the 1970s. And here you can see some illustrations of one of the earliest elections to take place using the new system at Taunton in 1873, so just a year after the Pontefract election. As at Pontefract, voters presented themselves at their designated polling station, they gave their details to the officials, collected their ballot paper, went into a private booth or compartment to mark it, and then placed their folded paper in the ballot box. This was in contrast to the pre-1872 method that had involved voters stating out loud, often in the hearing of many other people, including agents of the candidates, what their voting preference was, and this was then recorded by the poll clerk in an official poll book. The secret ballot's first trial in a parliamentary election at Pontefract was generally felt to be a success. There were very few spoilt or rejected ballot papers, and despite a delay in transporting the ballot boxes from one outlying district, Pontefract's mayor, who was the returning officer, was able to count the votes and announce the results just 4 hours after the poll closed. One of the original wooden ballot boxes, which you can see here, still survives. And rather quirkily, it was sealed using a stamp which was used in a local factory to stamp out Pontefract cakes, and those were a type of licorice sweet, as you can see in the picture. The new system didn't operate entirely smoothly, however. There were reports of bewildered voters being coached by party activists on how to mark their papers. 3 elderly voters forgot their spectacles, and they had to be assisted using the procedure for blind voters. One voter resisted the new method totally by shouting "Pollington" at the top of his voice, declaring that he was not ashamed of his vote. He did not mind who knew how he voted. And there were also some rather haphazard arrangements in the polling stations. At one polling station, the compartments were rather badly constructed, leaving gaps in between them through which voters could look into the adjoining compartments. Polling stations were supposed to have a separate entrance and exit. And one schoolroom, which was hastily adapted for polling, had voters coming in through the door, but they had to leave through the window, which had been knocked out, and there were rather wobbly boards leading steeply down to the playground below, which made for a less than dignified exit. Potentially more significant issue was the high number of illiterate voters. So 199 out of the 1,236 who polled at Pontefract. This slowed down proceedings because for each of these voters, a special declaration had to be made and the room had to be cleared of any other electors and also the attendant policemen before their vote could be given orally and their ballot paper marked by the election officials. But Pontefract's mayor noted that with a large rural population in some parts of the constituencies, Pontefract had a greater than average number of illiterate voters, and he suggested ways in which this procedure could be sped up, particularly for the benefit of larger constituencies. The general impression then of the new system was positive. Childers, the winning candidate, was among those who rejoiced that the secret ballot had proved thoroughly workable. There were no allegations of bribery or other corrupt practices having taken place, and the unruly behaviour which had often marred elections was absent. Seasoned observers declared that they never saw a contested election in which less intoxicating liquor was drunk. The town was so quiet and orderly that local tradespeople said it hardly seemed like an election. Now, one factor which helped to combat some of the traditional disorder of elections was that it became more difficult for the rival parties to make announcements of the state of the poll during polling day. With open voting, it was relatively straightforward to work out which party was ahead, and updates were published while the polling was in progress. These happened on an hourly basis in some constituencies, and this could fuel a great deal of excitement, which sometimes spilled over into violence. It also encouraged bribery, as parties sought to maximise their chances of victory, particularly when the results were close. And some voters would deliberately hold out from voting until later on polling day in the hopes that they'd paid more for their vote. The changed atmosphere of the electoral contest owed a great deal to another key reform introduced as part of the Ballot Act, and it's one that's sometimes forgotten, and that's the abolition of public nominations. Candidates had previously been proposed and seconded at the hustings, which often consisted of a temporary wooden structure erected for this purpose. They would then give a speech to the assembled crowd. And as Philip's already mentioned, and as you can see here from this image of the Tynemouth and North Shields by-election in 1861, this could include women, children, and other non-electors. In contrast, at Pontefract in 1872, the candidates handed in their nomination papers privately and unceremoniously at the town hall. Unlike the festive atmosphere of previous nominations, hardly anyone left their work or business. Abolishing this public nomination removed one major flashpoint for election violence, but it also got rid of an important opportunity for participation in election proceedings by non-voters. As Philip mentioned earlier, they could listen to the candidates' speeches. They could also get involved in voting in the show of hands which preceded the formal poll. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that the 1872 Ballot Act was a straightforwardly democratic measure. For some, it curbed rather than enabled their participation in politics. And if the experience of Pontefract in 1872 suggested that elections in future will be rather unexciting affairs and free from corruption, this was a mistaken impression. Candidates may no longer have greeted lively hustings audiences, but election meetings became increasingly important as an opportunity for the public to see their would-be representatives face to face. The nomination day might not have been the general holiday it once was, but elections in many constituencies continue to be colourful events with a great deal of drunkenness and rowdy behaviour. Although the Ballot Act certainly helped to reduce the intimidation of voters, the election agents who came to observe at Pontefract suggested that bribery would still be perfectly possible in future. And this indeed proved to be the case. At the notoriously corrupt general election of 1880, 18 MPs were unseated for election offences. This prompted another major electoral reform to tackle the continued problem of corruption, the 1883 Corrupt and Illegal Practices Prevention Act. And we will be marking the 140th anniversary of that reform next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thanks very much for that. Absolutely delighted to welcome our next speaker. Dr. Gary Hutchison is a visiting fellow at Durham University in the School of Government and International Affairs, where he's been very heavily involved in a major election project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, examining violence in elections from 1832 through to about 1914. And he's also written widely on Scottish electoral politics in this period and on the 19th century Scottish Conservative Party. So over to you. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Philip. So I will just get this started here. Can everybody hear me and see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. Right, so just to start off with some context, Victorian elections were far more violent than you might think. So, for instance, in the last general election for the secret ballot in 1868, better be at the end rather than the start. So at the 1868 general election, there were at least 37 riots, over 100 smaller disturbances, and almost 200 smaller violent incidents. And what's not on the screen there is that there were an astonishing 17 deaths directly caused by the contest taking place. So that's 17 lives lost over the course of a general election. And it has to be said that this sort of carnage was not, in fact, all that out of the ordinary for an election at the time. Violence was a fact of everyday electoral life. Now, many Victorians had long thought that the secret ballot would make elections less corrupt and what's more, less violent. So this picture here is of Market Square in Nottingham in the present day. This is the same Market Square in 1865 during the general election in Nottingham. Hired thugs had waited around the town centre for the election candidates to make an appearance. When the candidates very prudently decided to make themselves scarce, the thugs took hold of the hustings platform, set fire to it, burnt it to the ground, and then pelted both candidate supporters with stones, causing pretty severe injuries. A mob of thousands of people then took complete control of the marketplace, and as you can see, the place was a bit like a war zone. Police were unable to restore peace for several hours afterwards. And it has to be said, this wasn't even the most violent riot of that election in England and Wales. So violence happened all over the country, north to south, city and country, but before the secret ballot, not to the knowledge of my project at least, did it break out in any general election in Pontefract, as we've heard, very famously the first place in the UK to use the ballot to elect an MP. So between 1832 and this time, things were peaceful, but this wasn't to last. So many thought that the secret ballot would curb violence. In Pontefract, if anything, it had the opposite effect. We found no newspaper reports of violence recorded in the 10 general elections between 1832 and 1868. But after the introduction of the ballot, violence occurred in the next 5 general elections in a row, some of it fairly serious. So during the 1874 election in Pontefract, miners caused a disturbance on polling day and some were arrested. Later, groups from the collieries caused damage to random properties after the declaration of the results. At the next election in 1880, a Liberal mob from nearby Nottingley descended on Pontefract armed with sticks. They proceeded to attack Conservatives, fights broke out, windows were smashed, and the group attempted to storm the local Conservative club. Voters were intimidated and attacked outside the polling station. At the next election in 1885, an outright riot broke out following the declaration of the poll. Liberals again attacked homes and offices of Conservatives, including the Conservative Club, and they attacked the chief agent of the Tory candidate. Police paraded the streets and clashed with the crowd, and emergency special constables had to be sworn in. In 1886, again after the declaration, disturbances broke out and windows were broken. And finally, in 1892, there was more rioting during polling and after the declaration of results. So, in short, Pontefract went from a clean record to 5 pretty violent general elections in a row. If you were a voter living in Pontefract in 1892, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the secret ballot had done nothing, or perhaps had even made things worse in this particular area. Now, it was still possible for even a historically peaceful constituency to suddenly experience repeated outbreaks of election violence in the late Victorian period post-ballot. Now, this wasn't just in Pontefract. As you can see on the screen here, there's as much and occasionally more violence across England and Wales after the ballot is introduced, represented as the red line here on the graph. So the 1874 election, just after the line, despite the advent of secret voting 2 years previously, was still the third most violent election in our period. But despite appearances, the ballot wasn't to blame for any general increase in violence in the decade or so after its introduction. Other factors did come into play. These include wider corruption, including the hiring of thugs by interested parties, popular anger and unrest, and the continuing, if perhaps declining, atmosphere of popular celebration and drunkenness, which accompanied many Victorian election contests. What the secret ballot did contribute to, though, was to change the character of much of this violence. So before the ballot and when the election very small. I think it can't be emphasised enough that to be a voter could be a very daunting thing. There might only be a few thousand or even a few hundred voters in a constituency. Your vote could really count for quite a lot. And what you'd voted for in the last election, if you'd voted, was a matter of public record. Often these lists of voter choices were published as books or even in the local newspaper, as on the screen. This one on the screen here even lists what street voters were registered to. So at the top there, George Abel of Northgate Street, Bury St Edmunds, was one of 606 people who plumped for the candidate Edward Green of the Green King brewing dynasty there. As you can see, being a voter before the ballot could leave you very exposed. Individual intimidation escalating to assault and destruction of your property was a real fear for many. There was the carrot of bribery, but there was also fear of the stick. Parties in the constituencies often hired bodyguards even to protect their individual voters and their property in the run-up to elections. One elector in Norwich even hired his own personal bodyguard because he had been assaulted at a previous election. Now, in 1832 in Hertford, for instance, this sort of thing was endemic. So thugs were imported from outside the town and specifically to assault targeted local voters to discourage them from voting and even run them out of the town for the duration of the contest. One poor voter was assaulted half a dozen times across 2 weeks just while he was walking through the market square. Now, the secret ballot largely removed the option to use this unsavoury electioneering method. Voters' choices were now anonymous, and what's more, there were many more voters in constituencies. Violence which focused purely on individual voters wasn't viable on its own in the new age. Though it has to be said, individual attacks did persist, but these focused more on prominent partisan figures. So during the 1880 election in Wareham and Dorset, for instance, Liberals hired a large body of drunken thugs for the more general purposes of disrupting the election, but they also directly assaulted the declared supporters of Conservative candidate John Earl Drax, and eventually they attacked the candidate Drax himself. But violence was more often adapted to the new circumstances. While individual voters couldn't be targeted unless they were wearing party colours on rosettes or the like, groups of voters could be targeted, albeit less precisely, whether divided up by wealth or location or similar. Now, a more group-focused example can be found in Birmingham during the 1880 election, where there were several polling stations in different areas of the city. At the Ladywood station, hired roughs illegally pretended to be special police constables to prevent entry to polling station, causing fights. At the St Paul's station, 50 drunken Conservatives threatened people trying to vote, requiring half a dozen policemen to be called in. At St Stephen's station, roughs allegedly prevented Liberals from voting and demanded money from them. They then stormed the Conservative Committee's headquarters, requiring the intervention of a dozen policemen. So Conservatives in that example deliberately targeted those 3 specific polling stations, located in geographical areas which were known to be strongholds of Liberal support. Elsewhere in the country in 1880 and during other general elections, supporters of both parties participated in mass voter suppression. Now, this is at least partly why recorded violence appears to increase after the introduction of the ballot. Small-scale harassment occasionally leading to violence of individual voters is much less likely to be visible before the ballot. It doesn't get reported in newspapers often, which means we can't find evidence of it and it doesn't appear in my graph. Mass voter suppression, by contrast, tends to be a bigger, messier, much more noticeable phenomenon. Other changes also contributed to the increase in violent events related to the culture and structure of elections, for instance. In Birmingham during the 1880 violence, for instance, there were many different polling stations and a lot of political meetings were held which turned violent in the run-up to the election. Before the 1870s, there were fewer polling stations, fewer political meetings, more of a focus on the nomination and the hustings. So essentially, fewer opportunities for violence to break out, fewer flashpoints. But the big Nottingham riot at the hustings before the ballot that I talked about at the start there may have only been one event, but it was much larger than the smaller 3 Birmingham disturbances after the ballot in 1880. It was much more intense. Overall, elections were becoming, I think, steadily less carnivalesque, less drunken, less heated after the introduction of the ballot. There's less evidence, however, that they were becoming immediately less corrupt, as we've heard. While the ballot didn't on its own lead to a reduction in violence, it was a vital component contributing to its decline. The ballot, alongside wider and later efforts to challenge wider corruption, further expansion of the right to vote, and broader social and cultural change, eventually resulted in a much more peaceful electoral culture throughout the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. That's great. It's now over to Penny, who I hope is going to be able to chair our Q&A session. And I think we're all going to become visible with turning on our cameras and our microphones for that. Penny, do you have any questions that you want us to field?
Oh, well, I've got a couple from me to get us started.
Excellent.
But I was really interested in kind of what Kathryn was saying around kind of the literacy angle, where actually maybe it becoming more of a secret kind of created a bit of a barrier. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, Kathryn, because I was really fascinated by that, and it hadn't occurred to me at all that actually making it in a written form would actually create a barrier to kind of, I guess, democracy and making it as accessible to more people.
Yeah, so the Pontefract election did have relatively high numbers. I mean, 200 out of 1,200 voters. And I think that is partly to do with the type of constituency. But, you know, there were lots of constituencies where levels of literacy would not be particularly high. There were some concerns that people would use the fact that they could you know, say, oh, I'm illiterate, I can't mark my own ballot paper, to sort of get around the secrecy angle, if, you know, if they wanted to prove that they voted a certain way. And that's one reason the room was cleared, so that you couldn't kind of, you know, rely on, oh, well, I know he voted the right way because I heard him. So there were concerns, and even when the debates that before the ballot that Philip referred to were going on, that you know, there shouldn't be this mechanism. And some people said, well, you know, if you want to vote, then you'll educate yourself enough that you won't need to use this mechanism for illiterate voters. You know, on the other hand, the voting papers, you know, there were definitely enough spoiled papers to suggest that some people did find it difficult to, you know, read it, and there were various court cases about, you know, how far can your mark be off where it should be. But I mean, you still have problems today with spoiled ballot papers. And cases having to rule on those. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, that whether people were using that as a mechanism. And one thing about extending the franchise is that it had always been associated with education, and that was a common argument. You know, as education extends, then we should extend the franchise. And obviously, we've got lots of illiterate voters, then that kind of, you know, goes against the argument.
If I could just come in, I mean, one of the problems with spoilt papers as well, I think that we perhaps lose sight of is, of course, that at this time, most people in England had 2 votes. Most constituencies elected 2 MPs, and that made the whole voting process using a ballot paper rather than orally even more complicated, I think. So they would have to read down and figure out which 2 they wanted to vote for, or whether or not they were going to plump for one. And as Kathryn's already mentioned, there weren't party labels on these early ballot papers, so everyone would have to be very well informed. A great incentive there, I think, for parties to get themselves much more organised, and that's something that Kathryn's written about in her study of constituencies and party organisation. I mean, yeah, every constituency in England, well, nearly all of them anyway, the vast bulk of electors lived in constituencies where you had a winner and a runner-up. Double member seats were the norm. So yeah, quite a complicated system to suddenly switch to with a ballot.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's so different to sort of what we know today. I've got a question here from John Bryan. Did the ballot have any material bearing on electoral outcomes? E.g., did it favour radical candidates? Happy to pass that over to you, Philip, if you want to start.
I'm going to pass it over to either Gary or Kathryn, because they're much more expert in the post. But I mean, you probably sensed from my talk that, you know, my preferences are for the earlier period, and I love public voting. I think Kathryn and Gary are better placed to answer whether or not it helped radicals.
Shall I go first, Gary? Because I've got an anecdote about Pontefract, which is that they immediate short term, they thought that actually the ballot deterred people from voting. So there was concern that, you know, there were about 200 voters who stayed away, and obviously the Conservatives who'd opposed the ballot said, "Oh, you know, this proves that the ballot's a bad thing, and we shouldn't have introduced it because people aren't voting." My other point's just gone completely out of my head now as to why. So perhaps Gary wants to step in and it'll come back to me.
I suppose I'll start off with Pontefract as well. I should mention the reason it had one of the reasons it had 5 violent general elections in a row is that the seat did become much more competitive. It effectively was much more closely fought, and we do find a relationship between effectively a marginal seat, or a closely fought seat, and violence. Whether it had an effect more generally on, I suppose, would more radical candidates be elected? I would say no, but caveat that by saying that these elections come on the back of the Second Reform Act, which then followed the Corrupt Practices Act, and then in the Third Reform Act, which means it's all rather messy at that period, which means it's difficult to unpick which factors caused which things. I think it's worth noting that after each Reform Act and massive increases in the electorate, we do end up with, apart from party schisms and the like, with the same few 2 or perhaps 3 parties alternating.
And of course, the Conservatives win in 1874, so there's no suggestion there that it's damaged their electoral sort of, abilities even in the short term. I mean, and there's plenty of evidence, I think, that later on it works to their advantage. So.
And it's probably worth saying that the Ballot Act means it's more difficult for us to, as historians, to analyse. You know, when you've got poll books, well, people have done lots of work analysing poll books and saying, we can see that this religious group voted for this candidate, or this, particular group voted for this candidate because of a particular interest. I did find one case where they thought that, I think it was one of the constituencies where there'd been an electoral patron, the Earl of Zetland, and a candidate was put up against his usual man, and if people thought that was because of the ballot, because people would actually be able to, vote for this candidate, whereas before that there had been no point whatsoever putting up a candidate against Lord Zetland's man because it was pointless, he would get elected anyway.
We've got a question here from Gareth. Were there also literacy issues around voter registration?
If I could take it for the earlier period, then yeah, sure. Voter registration introduced on an annual basis in 1832 for the first time. Lots of voters were very upset about it, particularly those in the boroughs that had to pay a 1 shilling registration fee every year, and had to pay their rates, keep their rate payments up to date to keep themselves on the registers. So yes, it causes major problems for those who are illiterate. The overseers and in the parishes are responsible for compiling it, but if you got a notice objecting to your vote, there was a lot of paperwork involved. You needed to be literate. So a lot of people who were illiterate found themselves beholden to party agents. It's one of the great things that stimulates those early conservative and reform associations in the 1830s, is helping voters onto the registers, many of whom would have been illiterate, and also helping to defend votes if they're objected to by the other party, because of course at this time everybody knows how everybody votes. So if you want to try and improve your electoral chances, you try and knock off as many of your opponents in the registration courts, which are held every single year. So yes, a major problem. But and of course illiteracy also comes up. It's mentioned in the House of Lords, who were very firm against the secret ballot in those debates from 1870 through to 72. Lots of people saying, this isn't going to work. And the Lords solution, which is a really interesting one actually, is that people should be given the option. They should either be allowed to vote in secret if they want to, or they should be given the chance to just, orally say who they want to vote for. Just keep the two systems running in tandem. And in the end, that was a step too far for Gladstone's ministry, and they rejected that amendment.
Fascinating. Does anybody want to pick up on the sort of later voter registration? We've got loads of questions, so happy to sort of skip forward. Question from Susan. Was there a noticeable difference in support for and violence associated with secret voting in urban and rural constituencies? if I pass over to Gary. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, so effectively variance associated with voting in urban rural constituencies, what you might see is a larger employment before the secret ballot of influence over electors. You might see far more rural tenants and the like who are under the thumb, so to speak, of a landlord who might tell them how to vote. That's still somewhat common in smaller towns and perhaps larger cities, but to a far lesser extent. After the secret ballot is introduced, you do see a difference in the violence sort of in the middle, well, between the Second Reform Act and the Third Reform Act, and after the Third Reform Act, which we think might have an association with the fact that it's effectively one Reform Act gives rural voters the vote to a far greater extent, whereas the previous one had focused more on the boroughs. So effectively, a change in franchise associated with the sort of thing does make a difference in these ways. But it's worth remembering also that in terms of where violence occurs, there's actually often not a lot of difference between urban and rural constituencies. So a county town might be a borough seat, but it might also host the major events of an election for its surrounding county, which actually means some towns saw 2 or even 3 riots in a row in the same, I suppose, locale, but for different constituencies.
Thank you for that. And then we've got a question for Benjamin Jones from Annie, who likes our acronyms. So what was GSM's justification for rejecting a secret ballot?
As I understand it, it was to do with what he saw as the ideal community being open and transparent. And as Philip said in the introduction, this idea of not wearing a mask and trying to present yourself one way only to sort of use the cloak of secrecy in the ballot to vote another way. And interestingly enough, as universal as at least among air quote real democracies as secret ballot voting is, it's not universally accepted. And just one that I'm aware of, the political philosopher Philip Pettit, who does a lot of work on republicanism, although this is a book of his from 1992, perhaps Brexit and Trumpism, he may have changed his views, but at least in 1992 he actually was an advocate of bringing it back, and argues that a lot of these 19th century concerns don't apply anymore, and it'd be good to see, what way your boss or your university vice chancellor votes, or whoever else. But yes, I think that's the formation of Mill's idea that in a genuine community you're open with each other about your intentions.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Ben. I mean, I don't know if you, like me, were slightly, when you first came across John Stuart Mill's thoughts on this, were surprised. I mean, he's the schoolmaster of liberalism, isn't he? And yet in his thoughts on parliamentary reform and on liberty, he talks about secret voting as encouraging selfish sort of class interests, getting rid of the community spirit. It would pander to the sort of selfish partialities of the voter. And he says, people shouldn't be able to vote as they please. It's not an individual right. It's almost goes back to sort of Rousseau and the idea of a partial and a general will. It's fascinating stuff to think of a major liberal philosopher who, is so important in our democratic heritage, arguing along those lines.
And if I can add an Australian connection, Chapman actually wrote to Mill to say how wonderful he thought it was all going, and but apparently to no avail.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I think we've got 4 more questions. If everyone's okay to hold on for a few more minutes, and then we'll kind of draw a line under those ones, so we won't ask any more after these. So we've got a question from Connie. She was wondering about the physical process of voting. How many different ballot box designs were there? Or if anybody knows.
The ballot paper itself was different in Victoria to South Australia. Victoria, their design was all the names were printed out and you would cross out all the ones you don't like, and it was a South Australian innovation to have the empty box next to each name for you to tick the one you do like. And strictly speaking, Victoria actually didn't have completely secret voting, which was another slight difference in that they actually had a number of each registered voter, and that number was written down to try and avoid fraud. So technically the Victorians could trace back the way you voted, whereas South Australia had completely secret.
For the UK, the design of the ballot paper was specified in the Ballot Act, and it did have a counterfoil with a number. So as we have today, you know, if you referenced a series of numbers, you could eventually get back and find out how somebody had voted, but that wasn't an easy process to do. In terms of the ballot box, that is a very good question, and I don't know whether that is specified in the Act. I mean, all the ones I have seen pictures of from the 19th century are that very tall wooden design with a thin slot in the top. So I assume that if it wasn't specified in the Act, that basically people copied each other. And there were certainly firms that provided all the sort of requisites, because there was one election at the general election in 1874, the Hackney election, actually had to be rerun because all the supplies which some stationery supplier had promised to the returning officer hadn't turned up in time, and some of the polling stations weren't able to open in time, and in fact 2 of them didn't open at all because they were still waiting for the ballot papers to be printed and for the ballot boxes to turn up. So there were firms that did it, so, and sort of, you know, the returning officer would sort of contract this out. So I guess they became fairly standardised, even if it wasn't set out in the Act. But that is something I should know.
So our next question is from Margaret Todd. In Norwich, the ballot seemed to change the nature of the corruption so that people were employed in huge numbers for imaginary electioneering. Was this common?
Possibly me again. So this is something that was described as colourable employment, where people would be hired not for the jobs that they, not for anything that they did, but to there's a great description from one election petition report saying, you know, people who only carried messages from one public house to another, and so people are being paid effectively for their vote and any other votes they can influence, as messengers or for the hire of committee rooms or as canvassers, but they'd only canvass one person, if anything. So yeah, I mean, this was hugely common, and it's one of the things that's really cracked down on in the 1883 Corrupt Practices Act, where they place very strict limits on, you know, you can have one canvasser for however many people you can have, you can hire one committee room for however many people, and any other work would have to be voluntary. And that's why party organisation becomes so important, because where do you get all these volunteer election workers from? You know, there are some jobs which need to be done, you know, even if they had sort of been escalated in the past as to the number of people who were employed. So yeah, it's a huge problem until 1883.
I would say also Norwich is a great example. It has 2 very detailed royal commissions looking at the elections in that constituency. And when you read through a lot of the huge numbers that are employed there, which is very interesting, are employed, it's not so much imaginary, but imaginary bodyguards, which turn out to be hired thugs instead. So a lot of the people who are hired for the ostensible protection of voters, in fact, are offensive rather than defensive.
So our next question is from Zoe, and she would like to thank you all for your excellent talks. Leading on from the point about literacy, did moving to the method of the voter putting an X in a box on the slip eventually adapt at all to include those that might not be literate? For example, today we have the symbol of the parties on the slip. When did that start?
In terms of helping the, you know, illiterate voter or the voter who might find things difficult, one of the things that parties would circulate before the election is a sample card with, you know, X marked in the right place. So you know that you've got to vote for the, you know, the bottom one or the top one or the top 2 or whatever. So they did issue some sort of sample ballot paper as sample polling cards to show people how they should vote. Party labels didn't appear until the 1970s in the UK, and I don't know when they were accompanied by a symbol. I'm afraid that will be later legislation.
Great. And then our very question, could you comment on whether debates on the ballot linked at all to those over canvassing and whether legislators considered doing anything about canvassing?
Does anybody else want to go on this, or do I again with my knowledge of late 19th century election law? Yeah, I mean, there were various attempts to prohibit canvassing before the 1883 Corrupt Practices Act. Radical candidates in particular sort of tried to forego as much election expenditure as possible, and one of the things they said they wouldn't do was canvass because that put pressure on the voter. I think I'm right in saying that John Stuart Mill, when he was a candidate for Westminster in 1865, he was one of the people who said that he wouldn't canvass, he wouldn't spend any money on his election because they didn't want to put pressure on voters. So for two reasons there were debates about abolishing canvassing. One, because it was one of these ways of paying people a lot of money to act as canvassers, and another reason was that it put pressure on voters. And then some candidates just didn't like the sort of grubby business. I mean, there's some hilarious descriptions from some of our history of Parliament accounts of candidates having to go around and drink beer or drink cider at every house that they stop at. And I think, the canvassing the voters could be a rather arduous process for the candidates. So there was someone who wanted to get rid of it from that point of view. But the general argument was that if people were going to go to the trouble of voting for you, then you should really, go to the trouble of canvassing them. Not necessarily the candidate personally, but, their supporters who would find out how they might want to vote.
I think the really interesting thing about some of the surviving canvassing books we have from obviously before 1872 is just the number of MPs who, like Kathryn said, found it a really big ordeal, but they end up often having to canvass people who would have the influence over the voter. So the number of women who are canvassed, the number of sisters, parts of the family. I mean, it's not always just the voter who's having to be canvassed. It's entire sort of groups, neighborhoods, networks of people, that type of thing, which I think, again, it speaks to the importance of non-electors in this rather public voting system that used to exist.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Thank you all very much for that. Sorry, I managed to mute myself halfway through that. The link to our feedback form is in the chat, so please give us some feedback, and we will kind of work on what our next online event will be. Thank you very much to all of our kind of amazing speakers, especially to Benjamin Jones, who's gotten up in the middle of the night to be here with us today. So thank you very much. And other than that, just yeah, take care. I hope you're all managing to keep cool on this very warm summer evening. But yeah, we'll speak to you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.